Okay, it's now recording. Now, we are looking at CSS margins, and we have said that CSS margin is a property used to create space. You're creating space around elements, separating them from other elements in the same layout. Now, here we are going to look at margin contribute to the overall spacing and alignment of the elements within a web page. Specifically, we're going to look at the top, the bottom, and then what? The top, bottom, and left and right. We'll also look at some sample syntax for that. Okay. Now, those one who are joining the class with noise, please save us. I have to deal with muting people. Okay, let me also be getting the screen. I'll take the roll call later when let people join. So now when we talk about CSS margins, we're basically looking at margins are specified in various units such as pixel, percentages, and then there are also in terms of rems, hems, etc. But for us, we are going to use the pixel. Please turn off, Tom, turn off the camera. When you put the camera, it takes a lot of data. Tom Gabo, turn off your camera. Okay, let me leave them. Now, there's also one key important thing that we need to look at it in terms of margin. Now, when you're looking at it in terms of margin, is that margins can be set individually for each side of the element, like top, right, bottom, left, or it can be shortened properties for that. So that is what we are going to have in terms of margins. Then we're also going to look at an example code of how these margins are being written. Is that okay? Now, before we get there, let us try to look at that part in details. So I can duplicate this, and then we look at this margin properties. So let's look at the individual properties for this CSS. So let's look at individual properties. So the individual properties are basically in terms of top, margin left. So this is how they are being written. They are in terms of margin top, there are actually 4 only. There are 4 individual margin properties. We have margin top, margin right, margin bottom, and margin left. So these are the actual properties for the CSS margins. Now, these properties specify the margin for each side of elements independently, like top, margin. We will also look at this with the example code. I'm going to show you some syntax of a CSS margin. Is that okay? Now, maybe I can try to share with you right now the syntax. so that you're able to see, you see the CSS margin. So let me first paste this here. This code doesn't look well because it's just in one color, but don't worry, when we, no, what if I open my VS Code and then I get it from VS Code? Let me open VS Code and then put this code in the VS. Then it should be able to come clean. Okay. So let me replace everything and put here. Okay. This is better, eh? Yeah. So this is an example of the margin. So it is going to be here, purposes, margin left, maybe you set to 20 px, margin right you set to 30 px, top you set to 10 px, bottom you set to 15 px. So this is what they call syntax for CSS margins. We shall do it practically we shall demonstrate practically on Thursday. But this is how we are going to do it. CSS margin, CSS margin left, margin right, and that is it. That is it with CSS margin. But let's just continue to gather some bit of notes that can keep your brain expanded when you're reading them. Okay, so there's also what we call the shorten margin property. I need to just duplicate this. So there's what we call also the shorten margin property. So the shorten margin properties can take, okay, let's have this up here. So the shorten margin properties, the margin properties allow setting all margins at once in a single declaration. It can take 1, 2, 3, or 4 values representing the margin from top, bottom, right, and left, respectively. So it uses fewer than the value that are specified. Okay. So, and it avoids the duplicates. So that's how they use the shorten margin. Maybe if you're interested, we can also duplicate and have an example of, someone is giving us echo, which I don't want.
That's gone.
Felix. You guys, you are so uncivilized. How do you join and then turn on your microphone? Okay, I'll take the roll call. Maybe let me take the roll call at this interval. Attendance. If you keep dropping off, that's going to be your problem. Okay. So we have managed to put that. Now let us try to look at an example code. So I just want to put this first in my VS Code, then I can pick from my VS Code. So this one is the example of the shorten the syntax for shorten CSS margin. So this is how the syntax is being written. So it's basically going to be the padding, the border, the width, then you put the margin 20 for shorten margins, and that take care of the top 10, 20 for left. So this is how you implement the shortened CSS margin with an example code. We shall do it practically, but those are the types of the CSS margin which are there. Then we also need to look at what we call margin collapsing. So there's another important thing that we also need to look at, which is called margin collapse. Okay, margin collapsing. Now, for margin collapsing, let me first replace this text. Then, for margin collapsing, this occurs when the top and bottom margins of the adjacent elements are in close proximity or overlap. So in that way, in margin collapsing, the margins do not add up. Instead, the larger margin values between the adjacent element is applied with the smaller one ignored. Now, when this margin collapsing happens, it affects the layout of the element, and specifically in vertical arrangements like paragraphs and listing. We shall talk about it later when we look at how this, when you collapse the margin and how it affects. We shall see how we can explain that when you are doing it practically. Now, do you also want me to give you an example code of margin collapsing? Do you want an example of margin collapsing? A sample code for margin collapsing. People are not talking. Okay, let me get for you example. Code for margin so I need first to throw this in my I need first throw this in my CSS, then then I can get the code for that. Okay, so this is the source. This is a short code for doing what we call syntax for CSS margin collapsing. This is for margin collapsing. So please, you will have the parent, background color, padding, then the child background. No, but basically this is where you're interested in. You have the parent, the child, and then you're doing a margin collapsing here. Margin 10 pix 0. Of course, this is where you implement the margin between the child element. We shall do this physically, but that's how you can implement the margin collapsing. Then we are now going to go to, we're about actually, there's what they call auto margins. Now let's go to look at the last one, which is called auto margins. Let's duplicate this. So we have what they call auto margin. Of course, basically the margin properties can be set. Let me just. So here, basically, with the auto margin, is that the margin property can be set to auto to horizontally center block level elements within the containing blocks. When the margin left and margin right are both set to auto, the element will be horizontally centered within its containing block. So that is how the auto margin work. Let's have maybe the source code so that when we are doing it practically, we can have that. It's called CSS auto margin. Someone is joining and I'm going to take attendance later, but please don't drop off. When you drop off, we want to be able to capture you. So I need first to throw it back to my VS code then. I need first to throw it to my VS code so that I can have it copied and pasted the other side well. Okay. So this is how we are going to implement what we call CSS auto margins, like centered, like margin left auto. So this will center horizontally, and then margin auto, this will center also horizontally. Margin left auto, margin left auto, margin right auto. They will center horizontally. And that's how you implement what they call CSS auto margins. Now we have we have now the last one. No, the second, actually the last one. It's called what? It's called negative margins. So now with negative margins can be used to pull elements closer to each other. Of course, they help or to overlap elements. So negative margin can create interesting layout effects, but should be used judiciously, as they can lead to unintended consequences and layout issues. Let's try to look at an example code of, I'll first throw it in VS Code, then I'll do it in, I'll put the code there. Okay. Okay. So this is how you do negative margin. So it's basically going to have negative margin, apply, margin to overlap. You just put the minus 10. That's how you do the negative margins. Now, you have looked at very good concepts here in margins. Now, the last one, which we're going to look at, it is, now, what are the best practices? What are some of the best practices when dealing with margins? Is what? You need to use consistent layout. Let's just try to have them in terms of bullets. Okay, this is okay. Let's have them. Okay. Okay. This can be our note. All right. So that is it. Understanding and effective utilizing CSS margin properties is essential for creating well-structured and visually appealing web layout. By mastering margin properties, developers can achieve precise control over the spacing, alignment, and elements within. So now the best practices is, one, you need to use consistent margin throughout the web pages to maintain visual harmony and balance. Be mindful of the margin collapsing and how it can affect the layout and elements, in adjacent elements, and then experiment with negative margin, cautiously ensuring that they enhance the design without causing layout problems. Yeah, so let's have a recap of this. Let me extract it to the peer. This is going to be lecture. Okay, this is lecture 9. I'm extracting it. I'm going to share it with you in the WhatsApp group. Okay, so let's have the recap briefly. All right, so with the recap, basically, we are looking at what we call CSS margin. And of course, since we are looking at CSS margin, we are looking at CSS margin, which we can say that is a property used to create spaces around elements, separating them from other elements in the layout. They are not difficult, by the way. It's just basically top, bottom, left. But of course, you need to take care of the 6 aspects of the CSS margin. Now, CSS margin contributes to the overall spacing and alignment of elements within a web page. Now, margins are specified in units such as pixel, percentages, but we shall always be using pixel, okay, for our demonstration or class purposes. Then, you can delete that, I think, okay, no. So margins can also be set individually for each side of an element, top, right, bottom, left, or shorten properties. Now, individual margin properties. So margin properties are bottom, margin top, margin right, margin bottom, margin left. These properties specify the margin for each side of element, and they are also set independently. Values can be positive or negative, determining the amount of space outside the element border. Like the way we use the negative margins, you can also use the positive margins. But it's important to use the positive margin all the time. But be careful while using the negative margins. Now, this is a sample CSS syntax for margin. Remember, we are not showing up the HTML, but all this, if you want to see the effects, you need to apply it to, you need to control from the HTML. Now, this is a sample code which you can have for CSS margin, like margin left, margin right, margin top, margin bottom. Now, we also have what we call the shorten margin property. So margin, the margin property allows setting all margins at once in a single declaration. It can take 1, 2, 3, or 4 values representing the margin for top, right, bottom, and left, respectively. So this is basically margins, top, right, left, bottom. Then when fewer than 4 values are specified, the missing values are duplicated from the specific value in the clockwise direction.
Oda siwulira. Katoli anti mpulira katayi.
Listen to this chimpanzee making noise in class. Okay. Let me take the roll call, then we move to the next syntax. All right. So this is a shortened, okay. So this is a sample code for margin. You will put that, you will see how much 30px is set for left margin, and but this is how you set the margins. You know this, you know what these are? You know what this is a property. These are selectors, and then these are values. You know how to set those values. Okay. Now, shorten margin property. The margin property allows setting all the margins at once in a single declaration. Okay. So how can we represent that? You just do the word margin, then 10px and 20px. What it means here is that the 10px is for top stroke bottom, and the 20px is for left and right. And that's how you implement the shorten margin in CSS. Now, there's what we call margin collapsing. Margin collapsing occurs when the top and the bottom margin of an adjacent elements are in close proximity or overlap. So in other words, in margin collapsing, the margins do not add up. Instead, the larger margin, the larger margin value between the adjacent element is applied. So let's look at it in terms of margin collapsing. So the margin collapsing can affect the layout. That is, it can affect the layout of vertical arrangements like paragraph and list. So this is how CSS margin collapsing is. So you can look at how the background, okay, basically is margin 10px 0. Now there is a 10px here. This is top, then left, what is 0. So the padding is 10px, but we are interested in what? We shall look at CSS padding, but we are looking at CSS margin. So the margin between the elements, when you put 0, there's going to be collapsing of the margin. Okay. Then we have what we call auto margin. The auto margin can be set to horizontally center block level elements within their containing blocks. When the margin left and margin right are both set to auto, the element will be horizontally centered within its containing block. Now, then syntax for CSS auto margin. Now, this is where you can look at how to set the margin. You just say margin left auto, it will center horizontally. Margin left right auto, it will center horizontally. Now we also have what we call the negative margins. So negative margins can be used to pull elements closer to each other, okay? Now, the negative margins can create interesting layouts effects, but should be used judiciously as they can lead to unintended consequences and layout. So you need to be very careful while applying that. Then, this is how you use the negative margin. You just say top margin minus 10, apply a negative margin to overlap the previous box. That is how you apply the margin, the negative margin. Then, what are the best practices? One, the best practices is that use what? The first best practices is to use consistent margin throughout the website to maintain visual and harmony balance. You need to use consistent what? Margin. Then the next best practice is to do what? The next best practice is to be mindful of the margin collapsing and how they can affect the layout of the adjacent elements. And then the last one is experiment with negative margins cautiously ensure that they can enhance the design without causing layout problems. So, and note that understanding and effectively utilizing CSS margin properties is essential for creating a well-structured and visually appealing web layouts. Of course, mastering these margin properties, developers can achieve control over the spacing, alignments of the element within their web designs. So that is it for today. This is what I will share the notes. We shall do it practically. It's not difficult because now at least I've talked about it. You know the types which we have. Now I'm going to share with you the notes. The only thing you need to know is that we have what they call individual margin properties. We also have what is shortened margin property. We have what they call margin collapsing. We have what they call auto margin, and the last one is called negative margins. Yeah, those are the one which we have, and we shall see how to implement them in the CSS. Over to you if you have any question. I'm taking the roll call. I'll also share the recording for this, for those who have missed. Let me stop recording so that the recording shouldn't be long. This lecture wasn't recorded. Oh, it is.